All right. Welcome back to the Cognition School Podcast. My name is Satoshi Takano. I'm the founder of ReactForge, located in Vaughan, Ontario. We're about 5 minutes north of York University. So if you guys are ever in town, feel free to let us know and drop by the facility and come see it. Today, I have a very special guest, and I'm honored to call him my dear friend. We've had a long discussion about different things in the medical field, and now we have Dr. Grant Lum, who's actually joined ReactForge as a director of sports medicine and director of the first responders program. So welcome, Grant, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
I know that you've been traveling the world, and I don't know if there's anything that you found very interesting in your travels that you can maybe share with us quickly.
So yeah, I mean, my family and I just got back from 6 weeks in Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji, which were all amazing. I'll say that obviously the scenery is beautiful, the people are wonderful, the experiences of being so far from home and yet, feeling at home because people are friendly and welcoming. I mean, that's a wonderful thing, right? And seeing how people live differently, like Fiji, especially if you haven't been to the South Pacific, just a completely different kind of society, how they operate, the pace that they work at. It's not like our go-go, North American kind of attitude, a lot more laid back. So, but I would say the interesting thing for me is having been in sports medicine all this time and having worked with lots of Australian colleagues, they have a very, very well-developed sports medicine training process there. The physiotherapists, the sports medicine doctors, orthopedic surgeons, it's a great training program. So getting a chance to pop in and visit with some people and sort of see what they're doing, the state of the nation, as it were, that was really fun. Reconnecting with some people that I know there too. So that was great.
Yeah, that sounds like a great trip. And you just got back a couple days ago, I think, right?
Yeah, like just over a week. So 16 hours of jet lag, still trying to get over that. So if I sound a little stupid today, you'll understand.
No worries, no worries. Great. So maybe for the folks that aren't familiar with you, maybe if you could just do a quick background of your career and how you're at where you're at now.
Sure. Sports medicine doctors in Canada typically are family doctors first. So we train in family medicine. So that's a 2-year residency. And then you might do a 1-year or 2-year fellowship, depending on where you train, in your specialty in sports medicine. I joke that I am so old, having graduated way back in 1992, that there actually wasn't a fellowship program here in Toronto. So I mentored with people for a couple of years and then went off and, we have a licensing exam you have to write in order to become certified. And so I've been practicing sports medicine for around 30 odd years. As part of that job, I do a number of different things, primarily working in the office and seeing patients in consultation for family doctors. But I've also done lots of on-field care where I've taken care of different sports teams, different events like boxing or martial arts, or the most interesting ones are, I used to cover concerts, so covered the Tragically Hip when they had 70,000 fans at Markham Fairgrounds. That was kind of crazy. But I was also prepared for those things because I used to be an emergency room doctor. So I did that for about 5 years. And so in my current roles as a sports med doc, I also do a lot of teaching. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Medicine, where I teach family medicine residents, some physiatry, orthopedics residents, pediatric residents. I teach them sports medicine. And then I have for a long time been a consulting physician for the national squash team. I've done consulting work for the NBA, for Major League Baseball, for the NFL, for the CFL, but my sort of most substantial role from a pro sports standpoint is that I'm one of about 80 physicians who are in what's called the Second Opinion Committee for the NHL, the NHL Players Association. So if there is a player with a specific injury where there's a dispute, they're not comfortable with the management that they've had, for example, or they want a second opinion, there's a group of us that are specifically designated by the league to give that opinion. And so for myself, there's only one sports medicine doctor per division for the NHL. So I'm the Atlantic Division sports medicine doctor.
That's very, very interesting. And just for the people that are not familiar even with the NHLPA, what exactly do they do?
So the Players Association is essentially the union that represents the players. So they would take care of the collective bargaining agreement with the league. So they're basically protecting the players' interests. So it's a collective run by the players, along with, of course, professionals like lawyers and other people, to give advice to the players and to make sure that, they're being protected as individuals. So this committee, which was struck some 20 odd years ago, is a joint effort between the league and also the Players Association to make sure that these are people like myself who are vetted from both sides. So I'm not working for one specific team. My salary is not being paid by X team, which then has an agenda to say, oh, we want you to have this opinion about this player. We're completely impartial.
Right. So that must be kind of exciting for you to kind of be in that type of a role. And obviously, having been a family physician as well, what kind of drew you into getting into the sports medicine side?
So, with respect to my role with the NHL, obviously it's a great honor. It's something that, as I say, across North America, there are really only 4 primary care sports medicine doctors like myself who are involved. There are some others who are involved in some subspecialty areas like concussion, for example. But a great honor to be asked to perform at such a high level. Like an athlete who's training who gets into pro sports or the Olympics. That's sort of like what I would see this role as. It's the pinnacle of what you can achieve in our profession, to be at a pro sports level and to be acknowledged as, one of the subject experts. What drew me to sports medicine, I guess, I joke most of us who are in this field, we're all kind of broken down from our own injuries, and we spent enough time in rehab that we thought, hey, that might be kind of a fun career. I was not a good athlete, but I was an enthusiastic athlete when I was younger. So I played a bunch of different things, but particularly I played some volleyball in high school. And so, having had a lot of different things happen over the course of years, that kind of drew me into it. I'd certainly say, coming from an Emerge background, I mean, I loved Emerge. It was a great job. I just hated the shift work. Really, really tough to do, like 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., 2 nights in a row, and then come back and do 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. suddenly. But the work was fascinating. And certainly a big part of what we handle in Emerge is orthopedic injury. And so while I was working in Emerge and when I had finished my family medicine training, I thought, well, okay, that's a part of my practice I really enjoy. I like the biomechanical aspect of sports medicine. So I'm kind of a physics geek. And so, looking at how the body functions from a lever and pulleys kind of perspective, I was interested in that. And then as time went on, after 30 years of practice, I soon realized that, it's not levers and pulleys, it's mostly software. And so the neurologic control of the body kind of became more of a focus for me in how I work. And so when, I met yourself and Ben Hum, our partner, to talk about sort of, does ReactForge fit into the kind of paradigm of what I do? What could I do, from the perspective of helping with the business or helping the understanding of the kind of intent that we have? I felt like it really fit well with, not just me as a physician in general or me as a sports physician, trying to enhance performance. And that obviously takes sort of a lot of different forms, not just physical performance, but obviously here, cognitive performance, psychological performance. All 3 of them are critically important from the standpoint of, the success of an athlete, but also simply the fact that in the evolution of how I work as a sports medicine physician, there's been a shift from these things, you've got this muscle does this and this joint does this, and that's kind of the end of it, to much more about the descending control of how the brain controls all these functions and how we need to understand and exploit that in order to help people get better. So it felt to me like this was just a natural evolution in my role as a sports physician.
Yeah, no, and that was actually going to be my question in terms of what piqued your interest about what we did here, and obviously you had tremendous background and experience to bring to the table, and that's why we're so honored to have you on
Thank
board
you.
with us.
I would certainly say, the things that we talked about in the beginning, where the emphasis has been on sports and athletics and performance, that's obviously of great interest to me as a sports doctor. But as we talked about, 2 things really struck me. The first was, and I'm sure you remember, I asked, well, what's the moonshot? And you said F1. And I said, okay, if you can see with the helmets in the background, I'm a motorcyclist and a car enthusiast and have done some racing and love that competitive aspect of things. And so the idea that this translates into, not just athletic performance from the perspective of, what we think of hockey players, soccer players, etc., but into the driver's seat or onto the seat of a motorcycle, that kind of competition. And then the second part was, I asked you, okay, who's the target market? And you said anyone with a brain.
I did.
You did. And I thought that was brilliant, because the truth is, this type of training, in order for people to enhance their cognitive function, there's really no reason why anyone on earth cannot benefit. The question obviously is the way in which that, program gets delivered, the commitment that people make in order to make sure that they're improving, that they're doing the work that's involved, like anything, like going to a personal trainer, like, watching your diet, all those things. But to me, it made perfect sense when you said it. I thought, yeah, that's not hyperbole. That's true, that every single person who puts effort into this process should improve their cognitive function.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, because going back to those earlier conversations, I mean, obviously, where we are today versus probably when we first started talking, I mean, but that moonshot is now kind of starting to creep into much bigger things. But what I really enjoy about this whole process is that it is applicable to other parts of your life, right? So whether you're riding a motorcycle or even a bicycle, and just
Oh,
trying to
sure.
watch out for all the traffic that's coming, and
Absolutely.
whether you're learning to drive a car and you're just making sure that there's you're in a safe situation, or that you have an exit if something does happen and if something jumps in front of you. So and in this day and age now, that people are not even looking at the roads, right? They're looking at their
Their
mobile
phone.
device.
Right.
And so it's not necessarily about you being a safe driver. It's how do you react to those types of people that, maybe you come to a stop, but the person behind them is still looking at their phone. They have no idea that you stopped.
You
And
know,
so, yeah.
I think the people who are already familiar to some degree with what ReactForge does sort of get all that. For people who might be tuning in for the first time, to understand that the training process is taking people and giving them an ability to process greater amounts of information. So number one, like not getting tunnel vision, but to be able to see a bigger picture. Number two, to process that information more quickly, right? But I think an aspect we haven't actually, I think, ever even talked about, which you really, I think, hit on when you talked about people who are distracted and watching their phones. I think there's an aspect to it where, in the person who is, like you say, learning to drive, the 16-year-old, I mean, I have a 19-year-old who drives, and like the phone is literally glued to his hand. Not when he drives, he's been taught that. But for people who are, these young people, the discipline to actually learn to put your phone down and to concentrate on something else, that actually is a skill you need to learn. And so, as part of cognitive training, this notion of, well, there's a distracting influence that will always be there, whether that's the phone when you drive, whether that's the opposing player who's coming up on you, to learn to filter out useless information or to resist the temptation to be distracted from the task. I think that's an aspect of training with ReactForge that we haven't talked about, which I think probably is pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that, obviously, while they're training, nobody's on their phone here, of course.
Yeah.
But also understanding how to redirect that energy, where they have that desire to have the phone in their hand, but then we can redirect it and say, okay, now we're going to do this. And as long as we can keep them focused on that task at hand, then obviously that means just naturally less time that they're spending on the phone.
And some interesting studies have shown that if you're studying for a test, for example, you're a high school student, if your phone is sitting by your side, it will distract you as much as if you're sitting and looking at it. So just the mere thought that the phone is there waiting for you to scroll and to talk to your friends and whatever, already it's a distraction. So this exercise of, I'm putting my phone down, I'm not looking at it, I am concentrating intently on this thing, that's a skill we don't really teach in other contexts. And so I feel like I said, we haven't talked about how ReactForge actually trains that mental capacity, but I think that is a big aspect of probably success, is just learning to ignore that distraction.
That I mean, we call it inhibition. It's basically, it's either they can do it or they can't do it. It's a red light. Okay, get used to
Right.
it, right? And still feel that you're living your life too. So I think those are really, really key aspects. Yeah, and as far as some of the other things that we're trying to do, and getting into different markets as well, from a seniors perspective, and just trying to keep their brain keeping up with the longevity now, right? So people are living longer, which is great, but
Hmm.
how do we keep the brain healthy as long as they are living? And that's one of the things that I think it hasn't been really discussed, I find, in in around us, because there's just not enough information out there, right?
I think, there's ample evidence that when people stay cognitively engaged, that reduces the probability of things like primary dementia of the Alzheimer's type. And so, there's lots of information out there where people say, do a Sudoku or do a crossword or these kinds of things, right? And that's great. And I certainly wouldn't tell people not to do those things. But I think the complexity of the task that is probably correlated to the improvement in cognitive function. We know that, right? Like you do something harder, it's like building mental muscle, right? It's you lift heavier, you're going to have a bigger muscle. You work harder from a cognitive perspective, you're going to build greater cognitive improvement. And so I think there isn't really at this point a process that's out there that is accessible to lots and lots and lots of people. There's certainly day programs at hospitals, in cognitive centers. There are some private programs, particularly in the space where people have had substantial brain injury. Just by way of background, early in my career, I actually ran the neurorehabilitation floor at a hospital here in Toronto for a year and a half, 2 years, where we took care of patients who had had either neurosurgery, whether that was for brain injury or cancer or what have you, patients who had strokes, patients who had traumatic brain injuries like motor vehicle accidents, falls from a height, these kinds of things. So I managed those patients for some time, and that gave me a lot of insight into cognition in that population. So in the more severe brain trauma population, there's a huge body of evidence that shows that doing targeted mental exercise, so doing cognitive rehabilitation in a formal setting with someone who is trained, improves the outcome, as opposed to, you had a stroke, go home, do some Sudoku, do some crosswords. There's a clear correlation to having a program outlined and supervised. And so when we look at the concussion world, so again, as a sports med doc, that's something that I've dealt with my whole career. Again, we know that in the old days where we said to people, okay, you had a concussion, go home, just stay in a dark room for 2 weeks, you're going to be fine. You had your bell rung, you're okay. And we know that that's preposterous now. And we also know that structured programs to try and help people improve cognitively, they work. They've been proven to work. So in this context, talking about people from a primary prevention standpoint in cognitive decline, we know that cognitive exercise helps them. What we have not proven yet, which I think, in my opinion, is likely to be a fairly straightforward proof, is that a structured program of more difficult cognitive activity is going to lead to a better outcome. I think when we take our experience in these other two areas of medicine and we apply them in this context, I feel like it's highly probable that we're going to have that proof. We just haven't, had the chance to do those studies yet. But, and certainly there may be some of my neurology colleagues out there who will come into the comments section and say, hey, did you read this study from last year? Okay, so I'm sorry I missed that one. But, I think it's highly likely that the interventions we're talking about in seniors to try and improve their mental health, there's certainly really no downside, right?
And speaking of concussions and dark rooms, obviously, something happens in a game or practice. The kid falls down the wrong way. His dizzy. He's kind of showing those symptoms. What are those things that a parent should do? Like, should they take him to the hospital right away? Who should they actually go and see?
So I would say if there's any risk of something like a penetrating head trauma, so, you've fallen and the helmet's broken, there's bleeding. I mean, obviously, these are big, big signs that there may be a major trauma to the skull. Like, that's an emergency room visit. If a kid, has a contact injury, whether with another player or, say, with the surface like the ice, and loses consciousness, the truth is loss of consciousness is not actually a predictor of severity of brain trauma. Back in the old days, we used to say, well, if you lose consciousness, that's a bad injury. But in fact, nowadays we know that that's not necessarily the case. The period of amnesia that an athlete has around the period in which they have their injury, that's actually the best predictor. So if they get knocked out, they wake up and they say, oh, I remember everything right up to the hit. I remember that elbow coming up into my face, and then I remember getting up off the ice. And that's a short window, 30 seconds or 20 seconds. That's actually not necessarily a bad injury. The bad injury is the kid who gets hit. He feels confused. He doesn't lose consciousness, but then later on he says, yeah, I remember the opening of the second period. I don't remember anything until we got home. That could be 2.5, 3 hours. It's actually a terrible predictor. But even in those instances, I think going to emerge is not necessarily necessary. Emergency room doctors are certainly becoming more well-versed in the management of concussion, and so they understand these principles better. I know that for us in our location in the north part of Toronto, we have a pretty strong connection with our emergency department, and so they are quite good at referring to us, and in some cases with those kinds of injuries, they understand that as sports doctors, we tend to manage those injuries more closely. We have the opportunity for follow-up. We have more experience in dealing with them, and so that's typically a referral from emerge to us. So I would say that for most athletes that become concussed, it's probably a sports doctor who's going to be the first point of contact or best point of contact. Seeing your family doctor and then getting a referral to a sports doc or what have you, that's probably the best way to handle it.
Yeah, because I think obviously, a lot of parents don't know, right? Simply are just not aware of the path that they need to take depending on the severity and such. And so we certainly do find a lot of people say, I just ran to the hospital, then went to the ER. So
Sure. Yeah. And I would certainly encourage that if there aren't resources available to people, that if that's the easiest and first place to begin, by all means do that. But, I think if someone gives the advice, well, don't worry about it, go sit in a dark room for 2 weeks and you're going to be fine, I would ignore that advice. There's lots of data to show that that's not the best way to manage concussions these days.
yeah, so that's interesting because obviously dark rooms is something that I grew up with, a long
For
time
sure.
ago. What are those other things that they should be doing at this point?
So, it kind of depends. Like now we look at concussions maybe a little differently. We used to say, well, brain injury is brain injury, can handle them all the same. But nowadays we understand that depending on the location of the injury, so we talk about different parts of the brain having different functions. And so depending on the area of the brain that's impacted, then that function is more likely to be affected. And so therefore we need to concentrate more on that function in order to develop the rehab program. So for example, someone who falls on the back of their head, there's an area of the brain called the visual association cortex or visual integration cortex. And that area is what processes all this information that comes in visually and puts it together. And, you sort out these images. Your eyes are controlled, kind of half of your eyes on the left are controlled by your right brain, half of your eyes on the right are controlled by your left brain. So you're taking all this information and kind of fusing it all together. And that's just the basics. So imagine trying to interpret things like moving images, scrolling on a screen, trying to read, the eyes are moving across like this, trying to process information while your head's turning. So all these things require synthesis and integration of information from a number of different systems. And so nowadays, the way that we approach concussion management is to test the ability of the brain to handle each of those situations, see where the deficits are, and then create a program geared towards that. In our own location, we have an athletic therapist who is trained in concussion management, and so he would be taking the lead on creating a therapeutic process in order to deal with those things. One of the biggest things that, a general rule that we tell people nowadays is where we used to say, don't do any physical activity until you feel better. So we'd say, physical activity, bringing up the blood pressure, bringing up the heart rate, those things would pump more blood into the brain, makes you feel bad, you shouldn't do it. Well, in fact, some very good studies in the last number of years have shown if you don't introduce exercise early enough, it actually prolongs the concussion symptoms. And so we try and introduce some form of aerobic physical activity pretty early. Like within the first week, you want people getting up and getting around and doing things. You may need to control other things like don't go walking in the mall, if anyone even knows what a mall is anymore, with lots of people and lots of noise and these things, because that's very distracting from a cognitive standpoint. But simply getting out and getting the heart rate up somewhat, pump some blood through the system, that's actually critically important. So, like I say, the idea of go sit quietly until your symptoms go away, which is kind of how we handled things in the old days. We absolutely don't do that anymore.
So even if they have, say, like, headaches or whatever, they feel like, the bright lights are bothering them and so on, you should still stay active. Is that?
I think, yeah, you sort of hit on two different areas. So, photophobia or like that disturbance with lights, or what we call phonophobia, so disturbance with sound. We do try and mitigate that in the beginning because you're just kind of irritating the system. But getting the body moving, getting blood pumping, there is some evidence to say that that seems to make all symptoms improve somewhat, even headache. What we don't want is to do so much activity that it actually prompts major symptoms, right? And so there's a researcher from Buffalo, John Leddy, who published these studies quite some time ago now, looking at athletes who had been concussed and had symptoms that were ongoing even 6 months after their injury. And what he developed was a protocol of sub-maximal exercise. So you would kind of push the athlete to the point where it starts to trigger off their symptoms. So let's say that's 140 heart rate. And then you would say, okay, we're going to back that off about 10%. So we'll start you at around 125, get you working for a while, see how you feel, and then slowly build that up incrementally. And so it was that information that led us to start looking at exercise earlier in the process of rehabilitation to say, do we want to introduce it even when symptoms are there? Because we know with John's work, these people all had symptoms. That's the whole point. They were stuck at 6 months, not feeling better. And so we said, well, the postulate is if we introduce exercise, that seems to make people feel better. Well, what if you introduce it earlier in concussion cases that haven't gone 6 months? And so then the studies started getting done saying, oh, let's try it here, let's try it here, let's try it here. And then looking at people who didn't have exercise introduced, and these two groups totally diverged. Right. So the group that had exercise introduced early, they got better. The group that sat around, being told don't do anything, they didn't get better. And so, these days, I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah, I think for the parents out there, I think this is very important information for them to know, because again, it's just awareness, and that's what we're trying to do both at ReactForge, but also through this podcast. So having this type of information is incredibly critical. Just I wanted to talk about another neurological thing that's out there, which is ADHD, and we certainly have a lot of athletes that have been either diagnosed or maybe not have been diagnosed, but they feel that they believe that may be true with their child. Any suggestions for how to, again, I guess it's really just more about managing the issue or the task at hand, but any type of suggestions for parents out there that either have diagnosed children with ADHD and they play sports, or maybe they work with us here?
I know that in our initial conversations and the experience that you've had in dealing with lots of kids with that diagnosis, you and parents and kids have noticed that starting to work in this process has helped them to maintain their focus, to decrease distractibility, etc. And we know that as part of ADHD, it's like kind of a dual-edged sword that, kids, we think of ADHD as, oh, they can't keep mindful of anything. But in fact, kids also have this like ability to intensely focus on just one thing, like to really drill in on one thing, almost to the exclusion of everything else. And so, from a cognitive management standpoint, I think our process, and again, as we go along, we've talked about trying to study this phenomenon more carefully, to document it with more scientific rigor. And that's certainly part of my job in the company, is to start structuring more proper clinical trials so we can actually evaluate what the outcome is in using this intervention in that context. So we can't make any claims right now other than saying what we've experienced and what parents have experienced. We can't say that, yes, definitely we're going to treat ADHD. That would be inappropriate. But I think, again, we know that in the treatment of ADHD, structured cognitive programming seems to work. So I don't think it's a giant stretch. But again, we have to be careful in how we articulate that. I'll say too that, and this is my own personal bias, and I have to be careful about this. I'm not a big pill prescriber across my practice. I joke we had 100 script pads printed when I started practice, 32 years ago. I think I've got 50 left. I'm just not a person who pushes medication. I am not a psychiatrist. I certainly have, no specific training in treating ADHD. And so if your child psychiatrist is prescribing medication, I am not the person to say you should stop taking it or what have you. But I do think in my own personal experience that I have seen some kids who have done better on lesser doses of medication or off medication when possible. And I think that's probably a truism in general in life, that if we can get people off medication safely and they do well off medication, that's a great goal. And if anything we're doing in cognitive training is helping people to achieve that goal, that's fantastic. But again, my disclaimer that I'm not a subject expert, that from the purposes of giving medical advice for that condition, if you have someone who's prescribing medication, I'm not saying don't take it. But I think we can all agree that minimizing the amount of medication that people are on for whatever condition they're on, to the extent that that can be safe, is a good thing. And if what we're doing is helping in that regard, that's great.
Mm-hmm. The one thing that I've found here, just again, this is all through our own experience, where I have a parent that would actually call me before they even start their first session, and they'll say, Satoshi, I just want to let you know that my child's been diagnosed with ADHD. So I'm not quite sure whether he or she can withstand the duration of the session, which is 90 minutes. And I said, okay, that's fine. And let's give it a go and see what happens. So as we're running our sessions, to me, if I hadn't have known that from the parents, I wouldn't have thought that that child would have been diagnosed. In fact, they seem to perform a little bit better because of the ability to focus on something that they're truly interested in. And we see that in our own tests. And at first I was skeptical myself too, right? Because I'm thinking, okay, is this really am I going to see a difference with kids that have been diagnosed or not? And over time, I'm starting to see like there's that divergence kind of starting to happen slowly, but we see that in the data that yes, the kids that have been diagnosed, and this is also there is a difference between some kids that come medicated when they come here,
Sure,
and some that don't. And so we obviously we keep it confidential, but we do see a difference with kids that have been diagnosed and come medicated versus kids that have been diagnosed and kind of stay off the meds. And we're starting to see some divergence there as well, that maybe there's a way that we can help these kids stay off the medication, but also continue their interest in whatever the activity is, and they seem to enjoy what they're doing. Again, I wouldn't have known that they were diagnosed if the parents hadn't told me. So these are just some things that we're finding within our own environment. We have like 1,300 athletes here, and so we're just kind of starting to see these dots of a bigger picture starting to happen.
I think, as we talked about in the very beginning when I first met you, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but effectively you were saying nobody is doing what we're doing. And so the effect that this has in different populations is unknown. We don't know the impact it's going to have. All we know is what we know. And as we gather more data, we can start looking at that data. We can start poking at it and analyzing it and saying, okay, here's a trend. Let's go explore that trend, figure out if we can create an appropriate study model where we can actually tease out from that population whether or not something is happening, right? And that's scientific inquiry. That's just the most basic of methods is observation to begin, spot a trend, design a study, execute on that. And so we're now at the sort of volume of people and the volume of data we have where we can probably start to pull that out. And as but the viewership doesn't know, we're trying to partner with organizations that specifically deal in research from the cognitive standpoint. So there are some private institutions here in Toronto. Obviously, there are also hospital-based programs. I'm still a hospital-based physician. I have an appointment at Mount Sinai where there is a research interest in this. And so as a clinical teacher, but not a big researcher, I'm trying to pull in colleagues and other people where we can craft a process to actually get some real answers to these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I'm really excited about. And I think there's a lot of interest from the academia community to understand what it is that we do here, and a lot of the protocols that we've kind of developed, they feel that is something that they can have an impact within their own community as well. So we're happy to work with communities like that. Obviously, with respect to your role here at ReactForge as a director of sports medicine, you're also the director of the First Responders Program. So obviously, you and I had talked a lot about as to why that's needed, but maybe you could shed some light on that and what it exactly entails.
Again, going back to when we first met, we were talking about the process and how it is that an athlete will be able to see more, think more quickly. The way you've put it is we run everything at 10 times game speed. So when you get into a game, it feels like you move in a glacial pace. You get all the time in the world. As both of us being people who've raced, we say, when you're in the zone, everything slows down. You're looking at the next corner. It feels like it's a mile and a half away. You got all the time in the world to plan when you're going to brake, when you're going to turn in, when you're going to gear down, all those kinds of things. And so I said, well, it seems to me that people in first response, whether that's ambulance, fire, police, military, they could benefit from this because ultimately that's going to save, both first responders' lives as well as public lives. Right. And again, I've been involved in a number of different business ventures in my time, but they all tie back into my role as a physician. So the mental health app I helped develop about 6 years ago, this kind of process. Ultimately, what we're trying to enhance is, number one, making sure that we're saving lives. Number two, that we're enhancing lives. whether that's from a health perspective, a performance perspective. So for me, it always comes back to, I'm a physician in my bones. I say that when I retire, I'll still be a physician. It's just part of who I am. And so in this particular context, the immediate thought I had, having friends who are in law enforcement, for example, and of course knowing lots of people in paramedical services, fire services, I thought, yeah, they'll benefit from this because that could save their lives, or it could save the public's lives. And so we have been in talks. It's difficult because obviously these institutions, they're slow to move on these things. It's a new process. It takes time. They're big organizations, but we're making headway. I think there's definitely interest. And so we're hoping that, within the next 6 to 12 months, we'll have some significant progress where people will be joining us and training from fire services, from ambulance, from police, and deriving the benefit of all this.
Yeah, and interesting enough, we have a lot of clients here whose parents are in the first responders community as well, whether that be in the police or fire, or ambulance, or even some in the military as well. And I truly find that we're blessed to have the clients that we do, just because of the types of backgrounds and diverse backgrounds that they come from. If those parents are actually listening, we're happy to talk to you about it a little bit more.
And you know what? I'll say, as Canadians, we're not as good at this as our American friends, but to say thank you for your service. As an
Absolutely.
ex-emerge doc frontline worker, we don't say it enough to the people who are out there on the front line. So I just want to say thanks.
Yeah, and obviously, we want to be part of helping those people have more impact as well, and like you said, saving lives, and seconds matter in every kind of urgent or
Absolutely.
emergency situation. So I think that's a key thing. Now, relative to technology, I know that you've been involved in a lot of technology ventures as well. What do you kind of see here with the wearables to what's happening with AI, and how it's going to change the landscape of medicine in general, and also now that people have access to ChatGPT or anything to kind of look up different things. How does that kind of role play now, relative to the your sports medicine background?
So I'll say, first of all, we used to consult Dr. Google, and now they consult Dr. Chat GPT. And the problem is that, and I know everybody knows this, but Chat GPT just makes stuff up. So, you ask for references, and Chat GPT says, oh, so there's this study from 2021, and the study doesn't exist, because ultimately it's just a large language model. It's taking a word and finding the next word that's most highly associated with that word and putting together a string of words in the context of what you're asking it. And so it's not the best search engine from the standpoint of, figuring out your medical condition. I would say there's probably better ways, but all of that continues to change, right? The engine design, the training of the models, deep sea, like there's lots of progress happening in the AI world. In fact, our mental health app has an AI back room, so that engine powers our analysis, where, for example, we're using it to we have a screening tool that's online. People go onto the site, they can use the tool and answer. They don't even have to answer any questions or anything. They basically just read some text. And on the basis of their inflection, their tone, their pacing, the AI analyzes that and determines a score of how relatively depressed or anxious they may be. And so these are ways in which, number one, we talked about consumers using AI in order to gain their own information. I always encourage patients to dig deep, like it's your condition, so you want to know more about it, but just go to reputable sources, right? Like that's the first thing. The second is using AI on our end of things to transform how we interact with data or how we interact with patients. I know there's lots of AI scribes that are being used in practices. So Satoshi comes to see me because he hurt his knee, and I'll say, right knee meniscus injury. And then the AI just powers out a whole bunch of text to describe what is likely wrong with his knee, which I would normally dictate or type. So that saves a ton of time. So AI is being used in that context. AI is being used, most notably, Harvard started this some time ago, where they have a diagnostic tool that patients can use, where it's a filter to say, okay, so here's my symptom. And so do I have this symptom and that symptom? It's sort of algorithmic or flowcharty, which we know is not really the way that medicine works, but at least it's sort of an iteration of how we might think diagnostically, and it gets them to the, okay, so maybe we need to hook you up with our urologist to talk further, or maybe you need to talk to a gastroenterologist or whatever. AI is being deployed on the medical side to interact with patients. In the context of what we do with ReactForge, I think it's an interesting opportunity because right now, we in the company joke, we just need to take Satoshi's brain and download it onto something so that everyone can see what's in there. It would be scary, I'm sure, but but the accumulated knowledge that you have in analyzing, an athlete's performance, in detecting in that performance what is necessary in training, and then to devise training for them. I mean, that's your incredible skill set, right? And what has made you so successful with training people. And so we need to figure out a way where, without having you in the loop for every single athlete, where the AI powered by you training it can then determine what is the best course of action. I mean, I think that's the evolution, is taking knowledge from individual people, maybe aggregating that, not just yourself, but other people in the organization, obviously, who have been doing this, and then trying to build a cognitive model that can analyze that data and then come up with a solution. And always, I read a quote not that long ago, which I'm going to butcher, so I apologize in advance, but it said, as much as AI is going to be involved in every aspect of our lives, innovation will always come from people. And so the AI can only regenerate, regurgitate, reiterate the things that we teach it, right? But it's not necessarily going to come up with something novel, some groundbreaking thing, because it's only doing what we tell it to do. And so until we get that, self sentient AI model that we're all scared of, like, from, Terminator or many other sci-fi movies where the AI takes over and kills us all, until we get to that point, I think it's going to be people like you who are going to inform the AI and tell it how to work. And you're going to come up with new solutions. You're going to say, hey, I could train the AI to do this. So yeah, we're not out of the equation just yet.
Yeah, and the timing is great because all these things are kind of colliding all at once, right? I would say in the last 6 months, maybe a year at most, is when it really started to come together anyway. And I remember about a year ago, we originally had the vision of actually having an army of humanoid robots running around in here, and because that would help to offload some of the laborious work that's involved in, as part of the training, not running the training, being able to execute stuff in the background while the coach is coaching, as opposed to coach is coaching and he's got to set up all this other stuff in the background, which can also eat up in time. So I think we're very close. I think, I always, my VP always used to say, like, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Well put. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a matter of bringing in the right tools as and technologies as enablers, because I think that folks that may not be technically savvy just kind of rely on the technology to take care of everything, when in fact it really should be us as humans going, here's how I want the technology to evolve around us and our day to day. And that's obviously the tech background that I come from as well. So I understand it, I appreciate the tech, but I'm not religious to the tech. As at the same time, I try to create solutions and say, here's what I need. If I had this, it would solve a bunch of different problems. And that's why I spend hours, and I was here at the office until 2:30 in the morning thinking about all these things, because it allows me to, look at different technologies that are out there and go, okay, if I could solve, 80%, I'll say 20% of the problems that I have that can free my time for 80% of it, then that's a win for me.
Yeah.
Always looking at different technologies, and I think that's important, that you try different things. And that's where I think, even in sports too, I'm sure you've seen this as well, but the change is a hard thing. Everybody wants change until it happens to themselves, or that they have to accept something, and that's something that we're always kind of challenged, because there's a lot of people out there that just say, it's whatever has worked for me for the last 20 years, and I'm not going to change it.
As a sports doctor, I have to say there are people who are still teaching exercises that we stopped teaching 20 years ago that we know create injuries. I've met personal trainers who certified 25, 30 years ago. They're still out there training people, which is fantastic, but they're teaching things that we long ago abandoned because they're dangerous. And you're right, people, it's a bit like music choices, right? Like we joke, when you grew up, like I think you're a little younger than I am, but in this age group, Gen Xers, we grew up with the super bands like U2 and people like that. And so then your musical taste gets a bit stuck, right? You're not necessarily listening to Dua Lipa or whatever, And so the problem is that people in training, coaches, parents, and by extension, then their athletes get stuck in training methods sometimes that are from 20, 30 years ago. And so there are people who don't understand the value of sports psychology. They say, you just got to toughen up, or whatever. Everyone's a winner. You just got to toughen up. I mean, I find that crazy, and that people don't understand that doing cognitive based training will enhance the success of their athlete. If they are sitting there thinking, that's a load of bupkis, for lack of a word that we can say on air. I think that's crazy. I think it's like someone who is training a hockey player and they're just having them do like low level, low state cardio for 2 hours a day. What are you doing? Like, there's no scientific basis for that anymore. So it just doesn't stand to reason that people don't want to evolve. But you said it yourself, right? Change is great until it happens to you. You got to accept that what you're doing might be outdated and it's time to move forward. It's hard to get people motivated that way.
Yeah, it is. And the more that we educate through podcasts like this or through the Instagram posts that I put out there, really just trying to educate the market. And I think that's essentially what we're trying to do, because obviously we can execute what we do extremely well. It's that, 80-20 rule, right? So 80% of the population doesn't quite exactly know what we do and why we do it. And they hear from other people and other coaches saying, oh, what Satoshi does is bupkis. And we hear all sorts of different comments. I hear it from coaches directly. But at the same time, I think there's a missed opportunity, because look at sports psychology. It was never a thing, right? So mental health was never a thing in sports. Now it's a huge part of it. Every team has a sports psychologist. Every player almost has a sports psychologist. So why that?
And if they don't, they should.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Right. So why is it that in certain situations something about the brain is important, but in other applications, absolutely not? You don't need any of that stuff.
Yeah, I think, like you say, we started this whole talk with the idea that there are three main pillars to determine the success of an athlete, right? There's their physical performance, there's their cognitive performance, and then there's their psychological performance. And these are all distinct and different, but every single one of them should be trained. And so, I have to obviously, in the spirit of declaration of conflict of interest, say, as a partner, of course I believe in it, but I only became a partner because I believe in it. The idea that it makes perfect and logical sense to me that that area of training has been ignored, ostensibly ignored for the most part, right? There are certain people out there. We know that in the last couple of years, more and more posts have come up. The one we talk about always is Fernando Alonso, right? So, for those who are not race fans, an F1 driver, older gentleman, some 15 years younger than me, but still in his 40s, who was performing really well when he had a good car. And, they showed him doing reaction time training. And everyone was like, oh, that's how this guy stays relevant in his 40s. Well, he is taking care of his brain. He's teaching his brain to react more quickly. He's teaching his brain to assimilate more information. I mean, that is so straightforward that I can't understand those who can't understand it.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's going to take that type of exposure for it to come to fruition. At ReactForge here, we do it every single day. Now that the summer is here, we've been extremely busy, and our memberships is growing to the point where I'm now thinking about, okay, wait a minute, I may have to actually cap the number of members here, because I don't want to oversubscribe and I don't want to be in a situation where everybody wants to book in a particular week. So now we're going to start to think about capping it, but it is definitely growing, and obviously we have our certified trainers across North America, and we have one in Europe as well now, and people are jumping on, and the people that don't believe in this stuff, I'm fine, we can live without it, and we'll definitely move on to to bigger and better things where the brain can be trained, and we know it can be, and there's enough science around that. And so, okay, let's now apply it and create more clinical studies and so on that will then prove and add credibility to exactly what we're doing here. I know time is coming up here, but I wanted to maybe give you an opportunity with any final thoughts for parents or players or coaches that are out there listening to this.
Follow Satoshi on Instagram. Please check out the company. Find out more about what we do. Give us a trial run. Come and chat with the staff. Check out the facility. It's a beautiful facility, 12,000 square feet, of highly functional, beautiful space where we can offer a distinct advantage to athletes over their competition. I mean, that's the thing, right? We want to be inclusive. We want everyone to train with us. We want everyone to improve cognitively. But as Satoshi said, we have a physical limitation in our size. Maybe we need to go from 12,000 to 120,000 square feet. Maybe that's our next move. But ultimately, this is like a cheat code for your athlete to improve. This is a way that they can train, which other people are not doing. And that's the whole purpose of advancement in training methodology. Every single time someone comes up with something that no one else is doing, that's what's giving people an advantage. And so that's where we are now. And so I would encourage people who are watching this to find out more. There's no harm in gathering more information and just finding out and keep staying open-minded. I think the same way as you said, sports psychology was hocus pocus 20 years ago. And now we know, lots of athletes, their performances were either made or broken as a consequence of their mental health. Cognitive training is just the next one of those pillars.
Yeah, I certainly would believe that as well, where we are essentially just trying to give our players an edge, and not just in their actual sport, but also the sport of life, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think it's something that we have what we call a Discovery Pass, and the Discovery Pass allows anybody to experience what it is that we do here, and we have those available as well. And so really just being able to book that consultation call where we're happy to get on a call with you, and we speak to every client here before they join, and or if you're in the area, you're certainly welcome to drop by. So I just wanted to thank you very much for your time, Dr. Lum, and everything that we always talk about. I always learn something new, and I hope that a lot of folks that are on this podcast have gotten some new information that they didn't once know. So I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for asking me on. I had a great time chatting, and obviously my mandate as a physician and also as a partner in ReactForge is to make sure that we get this message out there to people that there is a way to improve your cognitive function. We have the secret. And so, I would love, like you said before, there are going to be people that aren't necessarily jumping on the bandwagon right away, but 20% of 8 billion people in the world is still 1.6 billion people. So that's still a pretty big number for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look forward to getting there very soon. So,
yeah. Okay.
Well, thanks again to everyone for joining, and stay tuned. We'll definitely be posting this onto our YouTube channel, and now we have our Spotify channel as well. So feel free to look us up there, and hopefully we will talk to you very soon, and we'll have some incredible guests on, and I look forward to bringing some of those guests on to you as well. So thanks again. Take care.
Great to see you. All the best. Bye.
Bye-bye.